The mysterious encounter. The icy wind howled across the barren landscape of Krelos 7, a distant planet at the edge of the galaxy. James Carter tightened his scarf and pulled his coat closer. The snowstorm was relentless, but he was used to it. Living alone on this frozen world had made him tough. He had chosen this life to escape the noise of crowded human colonies, but tonight, the silence felt different. As James trudged through the knee-deep snow, his scanner beeped faintly. He paused and looked at the small handheld device. It was detecting a faint energy source not far from his position. "That's strange," James muttered to himself. "There shouldn't be any energy signatures out here. No settlements. No life forms. Nothing but endless snow and ice." Curiosity got the better of him. Adjusting his goggles against the swirling snow, James followed the signal. The storm made it hard to see, but soon he noticed something unusual, a soft blue glow faintly visible through the white haze. His heart raced as he stepped closer, the glow growing brighter with each step. Finally, he reached the source of the light. His breath caught in his throat. Lying in the snow was a figure unlike anything he had ever seen. It was a woman, or at least she looked like one. Her skin shimmered faintly, glowing with an otherworldly light. It was smooth and pale, with hues of blue and silver. Long strands of white hair spread out around her like a frozen halo. She wasn't human. James knelt beside her, his gloved hands shaking as he gently touched her shoulder. She was ice-cold to the touch, her body barely moving. Was she alive? He leaned closer and saw faint frost forming on her lips. Her breathing was shallow, almost non-existent. "She's freezing to death," James whispered. For a moment, he hesitated. Bringing her back to his outpost could be risky. He didn't know who she was, where she came from, or if she was dangerous. But as he looked at her fragile form, lying helpless in the snow, he knew he couldn't leave her there. James quickly shrugged off his coat and wrapped it around her. She was surprisingly light, and he lifted her with ease. The faint glow around her skin dimmed as if her life force was fading. Panic surged through him. He had to move fast. The wind grew stronger, and the snow stung his face as he carried her back to his outpost. Each step was a struggle against the storm, but James pushed on. He kept glancing down at her face, hoping to see any sign of life. She looked so peaceful, almost like she was asleep, but he could feel how close she was to the brink. After what felt like an eternity, James finally reached his small outpost. The structure was simple but sturdy, built to withstand the harsh conditions of Krelos 7. He kicked open the door and rushed inside, slamming it shut behind him. The warmth of the room was a stark contrast to the freezing storm outside. He gently laid the alien woman on the cot in the corner. Her body was still icy, her glow faint. James grabbed a thermal blanket and wrapped it around her, then activated the outpost's emergency medical scanner. The device beeped and whirred as it scanned her, but the results made no sense to him. Her physiology was completely alien. "Great," James muttered, running a hand through his messy hair. "How am I supposed to help you if I don't even know what you are?" He heated some water and soaked a cloth, gently wiping the frost from her face and hands. Up close, he could see strange patterns on her skin, like glowing tattoos, faint and intricate. They pulsed softly, almost like a heartbeat. Suddenly, she stirred. It was a small movement, just a twitch of her fingers, but it made James freeze. Her eyes fluttered open, and he found himself staring into deep, luminescent orbs that seemed to hold the secrets of the universe. "Hey, it's okay," James said softly, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "You're safe now." The alien woman tried to speak, but her voice was weak and unrecognizable. James grabbed a translator device from his table and held it close to her. The device hummed as it attempted to process her words. "Help," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm trying," James replied, his heart pounding. "Who are you? What happened to you?" But before she could answer, her eyes closed again, and she slipped back into unconsciousness. James sat back, overwhelmed. He had so many questions. Who was she? Where had she come from? And most importantly, what or who had left her to die in the snow? As James stared at her fragile form, a chilling thought crossed his mind. This wasn't just a chance encounter. Someone, or something, had brought her here, and they might be coming back. Race against time. The small outpost was eerily quiet, except for the faint hum of the life support systems. James stood by the cot, his gaze fixed on the alien woman. Her breathing was shallow, her glowing patterns dimming further with each passing minute. He didn't have much time. The motion sensors continued to beep softly, their rhythm sending a chill down James's spine. He glanced at the monitor, which displayed vague shapes moving through the snowstorm outside. They weren't human, not with the way they moved. He could see the uneven patterns of their approach, as if they were sniffing out a trail. James shook his head and turned his attention back to the alien. She was more fragile than he had expected, her luminous skin showing signs of frostbite despite the thermal blanket. He had no idea how to stabilize her condition. The medical scanner couldn't read her vitals accurately. It only displayed red warnings and unintelligible data. "Think, James," he muttered under his breath. "You've got to do something." He rifled through his storage cabinets, pulling out anything that might help. Stimulants, thermal packs, nutrient injectors. It was all designed for humans, but he had no choice. Carefully, he warmed a vial of nutrient fluid and attached it to an injector. "This might kill you," he said softly, kneeling beside her. "But if I don't try, you're not going to make it." The injector hissed as it pierced her skin, and for a moment, there was no reaction. James's heart sank. Had he made things worse? But then, her glowing patterns flickered weakly, and her breathing steadied ever so slightly. "That's it," James whispered, relief washing over him. "Stay with me." But the relief was short-lived. The outpost's motion sensors beeped more urgently now. Whatever was outside had drawn closer. James checked the monitor again. The shapes were clearer now. Tall, lanky figures with elongated limbs. They moved with an unsettling precision, scanning the area as they closed in on the outpost. "Damn it," James hissed. He didn't know who they were, but he had no doubt they were connected to the alien woman. If they found her here, neither of them would survive. James bolted the doors and activated the outpost's minimal defenses. It wasn't much, just a few automated turrets and a reinforced barrier system, but it was better than nothing. He grabbed his rifle from the weapons rack and checked the power cell. Fully charged. Turning back to the alien, James crouched beside her. "Listen, I don't know if you can hear me," he said, his voice low but firm. "But you've got to hang on. Whoever's out there, they're coming for you. And I'm not going to let them take you." The alien stirred faintly, her lips moving as if trying to form words. James leaned closer, his translator device picking up faint murmurs. "Run. Dangerous." James frowned. "I'm not leaving you. We'll figure this out together." Suddenly, a loud thud echoed through the outpost, followed by the sound of metal scraping against metal. The intruders had reached the outer door. James's jaw tightened as he activated the security cameras. The monitors showed 3 figures, alien hunters clad in dark armor, their faces obscured by helmets. They carried advanced weapons, their glowing barrels pointed at the door. James's mind raced. He needed to buy time. He activated the turrets, and the sound of gunfire erupted outside as the automated defenses sprang to life. The hunters scattered, their movements impossibly fast. One of them raised a hand, and a burst of energy shot from their palm, disabling one of the turrets. "Great," James muttered. "These guys don't mess around." He turned back to the alien woman. Her eyes fluttered open again, and this time, there was a spark of determination in her gaze. She struggled to sit up, her glowing patterns pulsing faintly. "You saved me," she said, her voice weak but clear through the translator. "Don't thank me yet," James replied. "We're not out of this mess." The alien raised a trembling hand and touched a glowing symbol on her chest. The patterns on her skin flared briefly, and James felt a strange warmth radiating from her. The translator device crackled as it struggled to interpret her words. "They want power. Cannot let them." James's eyes narrowed. "Power? What kind of power?" Before she could answer, the outer door gave way with a deafening crash. The hunters were inside. James grabbed his rifle and positioned himself near the entrance, ready to defend the outpost. "Stay here," he said to the alien, though he doubted she had the strength to move. The first hunter stepped into the main corridor, its weapon raised. James fired, the energy blast striking the intruder square in the chest. The hunter staggered but didn't fall. Its armor absorbed most of the impact, and it turned toward James with unnerving calm. "Come on," James growled, firing again. The hunter dodged with inhuman speed, closing the distance between them in seconds. James barely had time to react as it swung a glowing blade at him. He ducked, the blade slicing through a nearby console. Sparks flew as James scrambled to put some distance between them. Before the hunter could strike again, a sudden burst of light filled the room. James turned to see the alien woman standing, her glowing patterns blazing like a star. She raised her hand, and an invisible force slammed into the hunter, sending it crashing into the wall. James stared at her, stunned. What the hell was that? The alien woman swayed, clearly drained by the effort. "No time," she said weakly. "More coming." James didn't need to be told twice. The remaining hunters were already advancing, their weapons glowing ominously. He knew they couldn't hold out for long. "Hang in there," he told her, gripping his rifle tightly. "We're getting out of this. Somehow." First contact. James crouched behind a metal console, his heart pounding in his chest. The alien woman, Lyra, he now knew her name thanks to the translator, lay unconscious once more on the cot. The outpost was barely holding together after the first wave of attacks, but the hunters weren't done yet. He could hear them regrouping outside, their strange, guttural voices carrying through the blizzard. The momentary silence was unsettling. James used the time to think. His rifle was nearly out of charge, the automated turrets were destroyed, and the outpost's defenses were little more than walls now. He needed a plan, and he needed it fast. As he looked at Lyra, her glowing patterns faintly flickering like embers, James couldn't help but wonder what kind of power she possessed. What made her so important to these hunters? Her earlier display of energy had been incredible, but left her drained. She couldn't defend herself again. James tapped the translator device on his wrist, hoping it could still pick up her voice if she woke. He leaned closer to her, speaking softly. "Lyra, if you can hear me, I need to know what's going on. Who are these people? Why are they after you?" For a long moment, there was no response. Then her eyes fluttered open, glowing faintly in the dim light of the outpost. She tried to sit up, but James gently pressed her back down. "Take it easy," he said. "You're safe, for now." She looked at him, her expression a mix of gratitude and desperation. "They are hunters," she said through the translator. Her voice was weak but steady. "They destroy. For power." James frowned. "What kind of power? Is it something you have?" Lyra hesitated, as if weighing whether she could trust him. Finally, she nodded. "My people, we hold life energy. It is rare, valuable." She paused, struggling to catch her breath. "They hunt us to take it." James's stomach churned. Life energy. He had heard rumors of energy harvesting technologies in the galaxy, but they were mostly outlawed. It was said that some species could store unimaginable power within their bodies, power that could fuel entire civilizations or be turned into devastating weapons. If Lyra's species had this ability, it explained why the hunters were after her. "Why you?" James asked. "Why are you alone?" Lyra's eyes filled with sadness. "Last of my kind," she whispered. "They destroyed my world." James clenched his fists. He couldn't imagine the kind of pain she must have endured, losing everything and everyone she had ever known. But there was no time to dwell on it. The hunters were closing in, and they weren't going to stop until they had her, or until they were dead. The outpost's proximity alarm blared, snapping James back to reality. He pulled up the monitor feed and saw 3 hunters advancing on the main door, weapons raised. The storm outside had weakened, giving them clearer visibility. James turned to Lyra. "Can you move?" She nodded weakly, though she looked far from ready to run. "I will try." James grabbed a small energy pack from his supplies and attached it to her arm. "This should help a little, but it's not much." Lyra winced as the device activated, but a faint glow returned to her skin. She sat up, her movements slow but determined. "We must leave," she said. "Leave? Into the storm." James shook his head. "We won't last 10 minutes out there." Lyra looked at him, her glowing eyes filled with resolve. "Better chance than here. They will not stop." James cursed under his breath. She was right. Staying meant certain death. At least out in the storm, they had a slim chance of survival. He quickly gathered what supplies he could: thermal blankets, rations, and a portable power source. "Stay close to me," he told Lyra as he helped her to her feet. "If you feel like you're going to collapse, tell me. Don't push yourself too hard." Lyra gave a faint nod, and together, they moved toward the back exit of the outpost. The wind howled as James opened the door, snow immediately whipping into the small space. The cold was brutal, but it also gave them cover. They stepped out into the blizzard, the icy wind cutting through their clothing. James held on to Lyra, her frail frame leaning against him for support. Behind them, the sounds of the hunters breaking into the outpost grew louder. "They will follow," Lyra said weakly. "I know," James replied, his voice grim. "We'll have to make it hard for them." As they trudged through the snow, James used his handheld scanner to search for any natural cover. The landscape was barren, but the scanner picked up a faint heat signature not far ahead. "There's something up ahead," he said. "Maybe a cave or a crevice." They pushed forward, the cold biting at their skin. Lyra stumbled, but James caught her before she fell. "Stay with me," he urged. Finally, they reached the heat signature, a narrow crevice in the rocky terrain. It wasn't much, but it provided shelter from the wind. James guided Lyra inside and set her down carefully. "We'll rest here for a bit," he said, activating a small portable heater. Lyra nodded, her glowing patterns flickering weakly. "Thank you," she said softly. James sat beside her, his rifle in hand. The storm raged outside, but he knew it wouldn't stop the hunters. They had to keep moving. But for now, they had a moment to catch their breath. The hunt begins. The howling wind outside the crevice offered little comfort as James stared at the blinking light on his scanner. His heart sank. The hunters weren't just relentless. They were precise. Somehow, they had tracked them through the storm. Lyra sat slumped against the rocky wall, her glowing patterns dim and flickering. She was clearly exhausted, her life force drained. James clenched his fists. He couldn't let them take her, not after everything she had been through. "We're out of time," he said, glancing at her. Lyra's eyes fluttered open, her voice weak but steady. "You must go. Leave me." James shot her a sharp look. "Not a chance. You think I dragged you through a storm just to leave you here? We're getting out of this. Together." Lyra's glowing eyes softened, but she didn't argue. She was too weak to protest. The scanner beeped again, louder this time. James turned and peered out of the crevice, his rifle ready. The snowstorm had lightened, giving him a clearer view of the surroundings. In the distance, he spotted the dark silhouettes of the hunters, their tall, lanky forms cutting through the snow with an unsettling grace. James's mind raced. Fighting them head-on was suicide, but running wasn't much better. He needed a plan, a way to slow them down or throw them off their trail. He turned back to Lyra. "Can you still use whatever that power is?" Lyra hesitated, then shook her head weakly. "I cannot. It will kill me." James grimaced. That wasn't an option. He would have to rely on his wits instead. He scanned the crevice, his eyes landing on a cluster of loose rocks above the entrance. An idea formed in his mind, one that might buy them some time. He quickly set up a small explosive charge from his emergency kit and positioned it among the rocks. "This should give them a nice surprise," he muttered to himself. As he worked, Lyra watched him, her gaze thoughtful. "Why do you help me?" she asked softly. James paused, glancing at her. For a moment, he didn't have an answer. He had spent years alone, avoiding attachments and keeping his distance from others. But something about Lyra's vulnerability, her will to survive despite everything, had struck a chord in him. "Because it's the right thing to do," he finally said. "And because I couldn't live with myself if I just walked away." Lyra didn't respond, but her faint smile spoke volumes. The scanner beeped again, this time in rapid succession. The hunters were close. James crouched near the entrance, his finger hovering over the detonator. "Stay low," he whispered to Lyra. Moments later, the first hunter appeared, its elongated body moving with unnerving precision. Its glowing weapon scanned the crevice, searching for signs of life. Behind it, two more hunters emerged, their steps silent but purposeful. James held his breath, waiting for the right moment. As the lead hunter stepped closer, he pressed the detonator. The explosion was deafening, and the loose rocks above the entrance came crashing down, burying the lead hunter and blocking the path. The other two hunters stumbled back, momentarily disoriented. "Let's move," James shouted, grabbing Lyra and helping her to her feet. They scrambled out of the crevice through a narrow side passage, the sound of the remaining hunters digging through the rubble echoing behind them. The cold wind hit them again as they emerged into the open snowfield. "Where will we go?" Lyra asked, her voice barely audible over the storm. "There's an old mining facility a few kilometers from here," James replied. "It's abandoned, but it might have some supplies, and more importantly, it's defensible." Lyra nodded weakly, and they began their trek through the snow. James kept his scanner in one hand and his rifle in the other, constantly checking for signs of pursuit. The trek was brutal. The snow was deep, and the wind seemed to sap what little energy they had left. Lyra stumbled several times, but James caught her each time, refusing to let her fall. After what felt like hours, the mining facility finally came into view. It was a crumbling structure, half buried in snow, but it was shelter. James helped Lyra inside and quickly sealed the entrance behind them. The interior was dark and cold, but it offered a brief reprieve from the storm. James set Lyra down on an old bench and activated a portable heater. "We'll rest here for a bit," he said, handing her a thermal blanket. Lyra nodded, her glowing patterns flickering faintly. "Thank you," she murmured. James didn't respond. He was already scanning the facility for anything useful. He found an old power generator and managed to get it running, flooding the room with dim light. He also discovered a small stash of emergency supplies, enough to keep them alive for a few days. But as he worked, the scanner beeped again. The hunters were still on their trail, and they were getting closer. James sat down beside Lyra, his expression grim. "They're not giving up," he said. "We're going to have to make a stand here." Lyra looked at him, her eyes filled with both fear and determination. "Then we fight," she said softly. James couldn't help but smile at her courage. "Yeah," he said, "we fight." A dangerous alliance. The mining facility creaked under the weight of years of disuse, its walls barely holding back the raging wind outside. James stood near the entrance, his rifle trained on the shadows moving through the snowstorm. The hunters were close, too close. Their relentless pursuit wasn't just impressive, it was terrifying. Behind him, Lyra sat propped against a rusted console, her glowing patterns dim but steady. She had regained a bit of her strength after resting, but James could tell she was still far from ready to defend herself. The scanner beeped rapidly, showing multiple life forms closing in. James gritted his teeth. He couldn't hold them off alone, not with his limited ammunition and the crude defenses the facility offered. "Lyra," he said, turning to her, "you said they're after your life energy. Why? What do they plan to do with it?" Lyra hesitated, her glowing eyes reflecting the dim light of the facility. "They harness it," she said, her voice strained. "Turn it into weapons, power for destruction." James's jaw tightened. He had seen the devastation wrought by advanced weapons, entire planets reduced to ash. If these hunters succeeded in capturing Lyra, it wouldn't just be her life at stake. It could mean the annihilation of countless worlds. "We can't let them take you," James said firmly. Lyra nodded weakly. No." Suddenly, a loud thud echoed through the facility. James spun around, his rifle raised. The sound came again, followed by the unmistakable hum of energy weapons. "They're here," James muttered. The facility's old security cameras flickered to life, giving James a grainy view of the hunters outside. There were more of them now, 5, maybe 6, and they were armed to the teeth. One of them raised a glowing device, and the facility's entrance began to melt under a concentrated energy beam. "We don't have much time," James said, rushing to barricade the door with whatever he could find. As he worked, Lyra struggled to her feet. Her glowing patterns pulsed faintly, and she placed a trembling hand on his shoulder. "I can help," she said. James turned to her, his brow furrowed. "You said using your power could kill you." Lyra nodded, her gaze resolute. "Better to die free than be their prisoner." James shook his head. "No, we're not giving up yet. There has to be another way." Another loud crash echoed through the facility, and the entrance buckled under the hunter's assault. James's mind raced. He couldn't hold them off alone, but maybe they didn't have to. "Lyra," he said, a plan forming in his mind. "Can you control your energy? Just enough to disable their weapons or distract them?" Lyra hesitated, then nodded. "I can try." "Good," James said. "We'll use it to create an opening. But you don't push yourself too far, understand? We're getting out of this alive, both of us." Lyra managed a faint smile. "You are stubborn." James smirked. "You're just figuring that out." The hunters breached the entrance, their tall forms silhouetted against the snowstorm. James opened fire, his shots precise but limited. One of the hunters fell, but the others moved with uncanny speed, dodging his attacks as they advanced. "Now, Lyra," James shouted. Lyra raised her hands, her glowing patterns flaring brightly. A wave of energy pulsed outward, disrupting the hunters' weapons and sending them staggering. The force of the blast knocked James off his feet, and he scrambled to his knees, his ears ringing. "Lyra," he called out, his voice filled with concern. She was on her knees, her glow flickering dangerously. "Go," she gasped. "I can't hold them for long." James gritted his teeth. He wanted to stay, to fight, but he knew Lyra's power had bought them only a few moments. He grabbed her arm and pulled her to her feet. "We're not leaving without you," he said firmly. Together, they ran deeper into the facility, the sounds of the hunters regaining their footing echoing behind them. The old mining tunnel stretched out ahead, dark and treacherous, but they offered a chance, a slim one, to escape. As they moved, Lyra leaned heavily on James, her strength waning with each step. "I can't go much further," she whispered. "Yes, you can," James said, his voice filled with determination. "We're almost there." The tunnel opened into a large cavern, its walls glistening with crystals that emitted a faint, natural light. James spotted an old mining vehicle half buried in rubble. It was their best shot. "Stay here," he told Lyra, helping her to sit against the cavern wall. He rushed to the vehicle, prying open the cockpit and checking the controls. The systems were ancient, but the power core still had some juice. Come on," he muttered, working quickly to get it operational. The sound of footsteps echoed through the tunnel, and James turned to see the hunters closing in. Their weapons sparked back to life, and they raised them toward Lyra. "No," James shouted, firing his rifle at the nearest hunter. But before the shot landed, Lyra's glowing patterns flared once more. She raised her hands, and a blinding wave of light filled the cavern. The hunters were thrown back, their armor cracking under the force of the blast. James shielded his eyes, his heart pounding. When the light faded, he saw Lyra slumped against the wall, barely conscious. The hunters weren't defeated, but they were disoriented, struggling to regain their footing. James sprinted back to Lyra and scooped her up. "Hold on," he said, his voice desperate. He carried her to the mining vehicle and strapped her into the cockpit before climbing in himself. The controls sputtered to life, and the vehicle roared forward, crushing rubble under its massive treads. The hunters fired after them, their energy blasts missing by inches as the vehicle sped through the tunnel. James gripped the controls tightly, his focus unwavering. "We're not out of this yet," he muttered. "The final stand." The mining vehicle roared across the frozen wasteland, its massive treads kicking up snow and ice. Inside, James gripped the controls tightly, his knuckles white. Beside him, Lyra lay slumped in the passenger seat, her glowing patterns flickering weakly. She was barely conscious, her breathing shallow. Above them, the hunter's massive ship loomed like a dark shadow against the stormy sky. Its lights pierced through the snow, scanning the ground with eerie precision. James could see smaller crafts deploying from its belly, sleek and deadly, heading straight for them. "This just keeps getting better," James muttered under his breath. He pushed the vehicle to its limits, the engine groaning in protest. The old mining rig wasn't built for speed, but it was sturdy, and right now, that was all he could count on. "James," Lyra's voice was barely a whisper. He glanced at her, his heart sinking. She looked fragile, her luminous skin dimmer than ever. "Stay with me, Lyra," he said firmly. "We're not done yet." "They won't stop," she said, her eyes fluttering open. "You should leave me." James shook his head, his jaw tightening. "Not happening. We're in this together, remember." Ahead, the ground sloped downward into a series of jagged ice formations, treacherous terrain that could either save them or seal their fate. James steered toward it, hoping the uneven landscape would make it harder for the hunters to follow. The smaller crafts descended, their energy weapons lighting up the stormy sky. Bolts of plasma rained down around the vehicle, melting snow and carving deep craters into the ground. James swerved, narrowly avoiding a direct hit. "Hold on," he shouted as the vehicle plunged into the icy labyrinth. The formations towered around them, sharp and glistening. The vehicle scraped against the ice, sparks flying as it squeezed through narrow passages. The hunters' crafts hovered above, their weapons struggling to lock onto the moving target. James spotted a narrow cave ahead, its entrance barely wide enough for the vehicle. "That's our shot," he said, steering toward it. The vehicle skidded into the cave, the wall scraping against its sides. Inside, the space opened into a cavern, its ceiling glittering with frost. James brought the vehicle to a halt and quickly unbuckled Lyra. "Can you walk?" he asked, his voice urgent. Lyra nodded weakly, though her legs trembled as she stood. "I will try." James helped her out of the vehicle, scanning the cavern for any sign of an exit. His heart sank when he realized there was none. They were trapped. Above, the sound of the hunters' crafts grew louder. James knew it was only a matter of time before they found the cave. He turned to Lyra, his mind racing. "Listen," he said, his voice low but firm. I'm going to draw their attention. You stay here, out of sight. If anything happens to me, you keep fighting. Don't let them win." Lyra shook her head, her glowing eyes filling with tears. "No, I won't let you sacrifice yourself." James placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression softening. "This isn't just about me or you. If they get their hands on you, they'll use your power to destroy everything. We can't let that happen." Before Lyra could protest, the sound of footsteps echoed through the cave. The hunters had arrived. James raised his rifle, his body tense. "Stay behind me," he said. The first hunter appeared at the cave's entrance, its elongated form silhouetted against the light. It scanned the area, its weapon glowing ominously. James didn't wait. He fired, the energy blast striking the hunter square in the chest. The creature staggered but didn't fall. More hunters followed, their movements swift and coordinated. James fired again, but his rifle's charge was nearly depleted. "Damn it," he muttered, retreating further into the cavern. The hunters advanced, their weapons raised. James prepared for a final stand, his finger on the trigger. But before he could fire, Lyra stepped forward, her glowing patterns flaring brightly. "Lyra, no," James shouted. She raised her hands, and a surge of energy erupted from her body, illuminating the cavern like a star. The hunters froze, their weapons sparking and failing under the sheer force of the blast. The ground shook, and chunks of ice fell from the ceiling. Lyra's power was overwhelming, but James could see it was taking a toll on her. Her glow flickered erratically, and her breathing grew labored. "Stop," he yelled, rushing to her side. "I can't," she gasped. The energy wave intensified, and the hunters were thrown back, their armor cracking and their forms collapsing. The cavern trembled, the walls threatening to give way. James grabbed Lyra, pulling her away from the epicenter of the blast. "You've done enough," he said. "You're going to kill yourself." As the energy subsided, the cavern fell silent. The hunters lay motionless, their bodies crumpled and lifeless. But Lyra was barely standing, her glowing patterns fading to almost nothing. James caught her as she collapsed, her weight light in his arms. "Lyra," he said urgently, "stay with me." She opened her eyes weakly, a faint smile on her lips. "You saved me," she whispered. "No," James said, his voice breaking. "You saved both of us." A new beginning. The ground beneath James's feet trembled violently, and cracks spread through the icy walls of the cavern. Chunks of ice and rock rained down, forcing him to shield Lyra with his body. The glow from her patterns had almost disappeared, and her breathing was faint. She was alive, but barely. Above them, the hunter's massive ship hovered ominously, its weapons trained on the collapsing cavern. James glanced up through the jagged opening, his mind racing. The hunters weren't just relentless. They were desperate. Whatever power Lyra carried, it was their ultimate prize, and they weren't leaving without her. "We need to move," James muttered, more to himself than to Lyra. With a grunt, he hoisted her over his shoulder and stumbled toward the mining vehicle. The cavern walls groaned, and one of the icy pillars supporting the roof gave way, sending a deafening crash through the space. James climbed into the cockpit, placing Lyra carefully in the passenger seat. He activated the vehicle's controls, the engine sputtering to life. The path ahead was blocked by debris, but he didn't have a choice. He gritted his teeth and pushed the throttle to maximum, the vehicle lurching forward. The mining rig slammed into the rubble, grinding it down under its massive treads. James kept his foot on the pedal, the vehicle's frame groaning in protest as it forced its way through the collapsing cavern. "Just a little farther," he said through clenched teeth, as if the vehicle could hear him. Above, the hunter's ship began firing again, its energy blasts piercing through the cavern's roof. One blast struck dangerously close, sending a shockwave that nearly tipped the vehicle over. James fought to regain control, his hands gripping the controls tightly. Finally, the mining rig burst through the last of the rubble, emerging into the open snowfield. The storm had subsided, but the hunter's ship loomed larger than ever. Its lights locked onto the vehicle, and James knew they had only seconds before the next attack. He glanced at Lyra. Her eyes were half open, her glowing patterns flickering faintly. "Lyra," he said, shaking her gently. "I need you to wake up. I can't do this alone." Her gaze met his, weak but determined. "I can help," she whispered. James shook his head. "Not like before. It almost killed you." Lyra reached out, her hand brushing against his arm. "Trust me," she said, her voice barely audible. Before James could argue, Lyra closed her eyes, and her glowing patterns began to pulse faintly. He felt a strange warmth radiating from her, spreading through the cockpit. The vehicle's systems flickered, then surged with power, as if responding to her energy. "What are you doing?" James asked, his voice a mix of awe and concern. Lyra's voice was faint but steady, "Giving us a chance." The mining rig's controls lit up, and a new interface appeared on the console, unfamiliar yet intuitive. James realized Lyra was interfacing directly with the vehicle, enhancing it with her energy. "Hold on," she said softly. The vehicle accelerated, its speed and agility far beyond what James thought possible. It weaved through the snowfield, narrowly avoiding the hunter's energy blasts. The ship above struggled to keep up, its targeting systems failing to lock onto the suddenly evasive rig. But James knew they couldn't run forever. The ship was too large, too powerful. They needed to end this now. "Lyra," James said, an idea forming in his mind. "Can you focus your energy on their ship, just enough to disable it?" Lyra hesitated, her glow flickering. "I can try." James steered the vehicle toward a ridge, positioning them within range of the ship. "Just hold on a little longer," he said. "We're almost there." Lyra closed her eyes again, her glowing patterns intensifying. The air around them crackled with energy, and James felt the vehicle tremble as her power surged. Above, the hunter's ship began to falter. Its lights flickered, and its engines sputtered as Lyra's energy disrupted its systems. The smaller crafts circling the area veered off course, crashing into the snow below. Come on," James muttered, watching the ship struggle to stay aloft. With one final pulse of energy, Lyra collapsed, her glow fading entirely. The hunter's ship let out a deafening groan as its engines failed, sending it crashing into the snowfield. A massive explosion lit up the horizon, and James shielded his eyes from the blinding light. When the dust settled, silence fell over the landscape. The hunters were gone, their ship reduced to smoldering wreckage. James turned to Lyra, panic gripping his chest. She was motionless, her skin pale and lifeless. "Lyra," he shouted, shaking her gently. For a terrifying moment, there was no response. Then her eyes fluttered open, faintly glowing once more. "You did it," she whispered. James let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "No," he said, a smile breaking across his face. "We did it." He carried her out of the vehicle, the wreckage of the hunter's ship still smoldering in the distance. The storm had cleared, revealing a star-filled sky. "What now?" Lyra asked weakly. James looked up at the stars, his expression thoughtful. "We find somewhere safe," he said. "Somewhere they'll never find you." Lyra managed a faint smile. "With you, I feel safe." As they stood together under the vast sky, James knew their journey was far from over. But for the first time in years, he felt hope, a hope that together, they could face whatever came next.